The officer thought she was just another black woman he could bully until she walked into the courtroom and ruined his career, making him realize his mistake. The road stretched endlessly before her, slick with rain, shimmering under the glow of distant streetlights. The late-night drizzle had settled into a cold mist, wrapping around the highway like an unspoken warning. It was the kind of night where most people were already home, warm, safe, far from the emptiness of the road. But Monica Hayes was still driving, her fingers tapping idly against the wheel, the soft hum of John Coltrane's saxophone filling the silence. She had been on the road for nearly 3 hours, exhaustion pressing against her like an old, familiar weight. A weekend visit to Baton Rouge had turned into a longer stay than expected, and now all she wanted was to be home in Memphis, Tennessee, tucked away from the world for just a little while. She wasn't in uniform tonight, just a simple navy sweatshirt and jeans. Her hair pulled back in a loose bun. Nothing about her stood out. Just another tired driver heading home. But the moment she saw the red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror, she knew that didn't matter. Her grip on the wheel tightened for half a second. A reflex, a memory, a warning. But her expression remained calm. She signaled, changed lanes, and eased onto the shoulder, letting the patrol car settle behind her. She exhaled, put the car in park, hands on the wheel, visible at all times. The glow from the patrol car's headlights spilled into her rearview mirror, blinding her momentarily. She could hear the distant hum of passing traffic, but knew in this moment she was alone. The officer took his time. His door creaked open. Heavy boots hit the pavement. Slow, measured steps. The sound of authority wrapped in entitlement. Monica turned her head slightly, watching him approach through the side mirror. He was built like a man who had spent years commanding obedience, his posture thick with confidence. The name on his badge caught the light. Sergeant Timothy Knox. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation. Just flat, impatient authority. Monica moved slowly, deliberately, reaching toward the glove compartment. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. Knox didn't answer right away. Instead, he took the documents from her hand, holding them just out of reach as his flashlight trailed over the back of her car. Taillights out, she frowned. That couldn't be right. She had her car serviced last month. Knox finally looked at her, his eyes sharp and unreadable. "Are you arguing with me?" The air between them shifted. That quiet, unspoken moment where power meets resistance. Where one side expects the other to fold. Monica had seen it before. In military briefings, in de-escalation training, in real-world combat zones where men with unchecked power acted as if the rules didn't apply to them. But she also knew her rights. "I'm just saying," she replied, keeping her voice even, controlled. "I had my lights checked last month, but if there's an issue, I'll get it fixed." Knox ignored her words completely. "Step out of the car," he ordered. A muscle in Monica's jaw tightened. "Mind telling me why?" The corners of his mouth twitched into a slow smirk. "Because I said so." For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The space between them thickened with tension. Then, Monica unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed open the door. The night air was cooler than expected, sharp against her skin. Knox stepped back slightly, his eyes scanning her, taking in her posture, her stance. The way she didn't shrink under his gaze. She could feel him sizing her up, deciding just how much he could get away with. "Turn around, hands on the car." This time, she hesitated. For what reason? Knox's smirk vanished. "Are you resisting?" Monica held her ground. "Number, I'm asking a question." A flicker of something crossed his face. Annoyance, maybe. Amusement. Then, without warning, he reached for his radio. "We got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered into the speaker. Then, louder, "Turn around." Monica felt her heartbeat steady, breathing measured. She knew exactly what was happening. She had two choices. Comply now and fight this later, or push back and risk escalation. She wasn't about to become another statistic. Slowly, deliberately, she turned and placed her hands against the cool metal of her car. Knox wasted no time. He yanked her arms behind her back, snapping the handcuffs on too tight. Then, with unnecessary force, he shoved her toward his patrol car. "You don't know what you're doing," she murmured, her voice calm. Knox chuckled. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing." But he didn't. Not even close. Inside the cramped back seat of the patrol car, Monica sat still, wrists burning against the cuffs. The hard plastic dug into her back, but she made no move to adjust herself. Knox climbed into the driver's seat, whistling a low, tuneless hum as he threw the car into gear. "Most people just keep their mouth shut when I tell them to step out," he said after a moment. Monica exhaled through her nose. "And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop." Knox laughed, shaking his head. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody." She met his gaze through the partition. "I don't think. I know." That made him pause. Just for a second. His knuckles flexed around the wheel, a flicker of irritation breaking through his smug expression. But he covered it up quick. "You military?" he asked, his tone suddenly shifting. Monica didn't answer. "Yeah, I figured," he went on. "You got that attitude, that above-the-law type. Bet you thought I'd back off if you threw that around, huh?" Still, she stayed silent. Knox clicked his tongue. "Shame." He shook his head. "If you'd just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this." Monica's jaw tightened. The audacity of it. As if this was somehow her fault. Up ahead, the station came into view. A squat, gray brick building. Sitting just off the main road, Knox pulled into a reserved spot, killed the engine, and turned to look at her through the partition. "Gotta say," he murmured, smirking once more. "I do love when they make it easy." Before Monica could respond, he was already out of the car, slamming the door shut behind him. A second later, her door swung open. "Let's go," Knox ordered. Monica twisted her wrists slightly. The cuffs bit into her skin. She kept her head high as he led her inside, because he had no idea who he had just messed with. The air inside the holding cell was thick, stagnant, stale, the kind of air that carried the weight of 100 unspoken stories. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in a lifeless yellow glow. Monica Hayes sat on the cold metal bench, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her wrists still raw from the cuffs. She was tired, but not broken. She had seen war zones more chaotic than this. She had stood in briefing rooms where life or death decisions were made in a matter of seconds. And yet, here she was, detained like a common criminal over a traffic stop that should have never happened. But the thing about power, it shifts. And in that moment, sitting behind those rusted bars, she could feel it beginning to shift. Somewhere outside, in the polished corridors of a bureaucratic machine designed to protect its own, questions were being asked. Calls were being made. She knew because she had seen the first crack in the foundation. It came in the form of a nervous young officer, maybe in his late 20s, with a clipboard clutched too tightly in his hands. He had approached Sergeant Timothy Knox with a hesitation that felt almost like guilt. "Sergeant, we got a call." Knox barely looked at him. "And? It's from higher up. Someone's asking about the arrest." Knox stilled. It was subtle, a fraction of a second where his arrogance faltered. He glanced toward Monica, and for the first time that night, she saw something flicker behind his eyes. Uncertainty. She tilted her head, watching. Now he feels it. The power. The shift. Knox clenched his jaw and leaned in toward the younger officer. His voice dropped, sharp, clipped. "I'll handle it." But Monica already knew. He wouldn't be handling anything, because some fights are bigger than a single person. The morning light was harsh through the tall courthouse windows, casting streaks across the polished wooden benches. The room was filled with the low murmur of voices, lawyers shuffling papers, clerks moving with purpose, spectators whispering about the case that had begun to draw attention beyond the walls of the courtroom. Monica sat at the defense table, shoulders squared, gaze steady. She wasn't in uniform, but she carried herself as if she was. Years of military discipline had ingrained it in her. The quiet confidence, the presence that made men like Knox uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite explain. Her attorney, Danielle Whitman, sat beside her, flipping through documents with a meticulous precision. She was young, but sharp, one of those lawyers who had built her career taking on cases exactly like this. Cases where the system thought it could bulldoze over the wrong person. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room swung open, and Knox walked in. He still had that posture, the squared shoulders, the lifted chin, the forced confidence of a man used to walking into rooms and owning them. But today, there was a stiffness in his step, a flicker of something Monica had seen before. Not fear. Not yet. Doubt. She met his gaze. He looked away. Good. The judge entered, and the room settled into a tense silence. Judge Alan Kirkland, an older man with weary eyes, adjusted his glasses and got straight to business. All right, he sighed, skimming over the case file. Let's get to it. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with the polished, rehearsed tone of someone used to arguing before a jury, cleared his throat. Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Colonel Monica Hayes, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, an internal review has uncovered a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Timothy Knox. A ripple of murmurs moved through the room. Knox shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. The judge peered at him over his glasses. Sergeant Knox, do you have an explanation? Knox leaned forward, clearing his throat. Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. The prosecutor cut him off mid-sentence. Uncooperative? He turned, lifting a document from the table. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes has served in the United States Air Force for over 2 decades. She is a decorated officer with multiple commendations. No criminal history. No outstanding citations. Are you telling me that despite all of this, she was such a threat that you had to arrest her over a broken tail light? Knox opened his mouth, then shut it. The silence stretched. The prosecutor didn't give him room to recover. Additionally, he continued, flipping through his papers, an internal review of your arrest records shows a disproportionate number of stops involving black drivers. In fact, you have detained black motorists at nearly 4 times the rate of white motorists in this district. The murmurs grew louder. Knox's face turned red. Judge Kirkland set his file down with a sigh. Sergeant, I don't like what I'm hearing. Knox crossed his arms, defensive now. She resisted. The prosecutor barely reacted. He turned to the bailiff. Let's play the footage. A large screen lowered at the front of the courtroom. The video began to play. Monica didn't turn to watch. She had already lived it. Knox's voice, barking orders. Her own voice, calm, controlled. The moment where he escalated without reason. The way he tightened the cuffs just a little too much. Just to prove a point. The judge leaned forward, his fingers steepled. Sergeant Knox, do you have anything to say for yourself? Knox opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The gavel came down, sharp and final. The charges against Lieutenant Colonel Hayes are hereby dismissed. Furthermore, I am recommending an immediate internal investigation into Sergeant Knox's conduct. The tension in the room shattered like a glass hitting concrete. Knox looked like he had been punched in the gut. His face flushed red, hands clenching into fists. He turned sharply on his heel, storming out of the courtroom, the sound of his boots echoing down the hallway. Monica exhaled. Slow, steady, controlled. She had never doubted how this would end, but Knox had. And now, he was the one fighting for his reputation. Across town, in a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a barber shop, Monica stirred her coffee slowly, watching as the case hit the news. The footage had gone viral. The headlines flashed across the screen. Lieutenant Colonel wrongfully arrested. Officer under investigation. Body cam footage exposes racial profiling in Memphis PD. She wasn't surprised. She had known the second Knox pulled her over how this would play out. Because men like him, they think they can bend the law to their will. Until someone reminds them they are not above it. Her phone buzzed. A message from Whitman. Knox has been suspended. Internal Affairs is launching a full review. Monica took a slow sip of her coffee. Good. She glanced out the window, watching as the world moved on around her. This fight wasn't over. Not for her. Not for the people Knox had likely hurt before. But today was a win. The newsroom was buzzing. Phones ringing. Reporters huddled over screens. Editors barking orders as the Knox case made its way into the national conversation. The footage had spread like wildfire. A single body cam video dismantling years of unchecked power. Monica Hayes watched from a distance, the television in the corner of the cafe cycling through breaking news updates. Her name was everywhere now, not because she wanted it to be, because it had to be. The voice of the news anchor filled the room, even as people pretended not to listen. Sergeant Timothy Knox, a 14-year veteran of the Memphis Police Department, has been placed on indefinite suspension pending an internal investigation. Sources confirm that Knox is facing multiple complaints regarding racial profiling and excessive use of force. The investigation comes after the wrongful arrest of Lieutenant Colonel Monica Hayes, a decorated Air Force officer who was detained without probable cause. The word should have felt like justice, but Monica knew better. Justice wasn't a headline. It wasn't a viral video. Justice was what came after. She had spent her entire career operating in systems built on order, protocol, and discipline. But law enforcement, that was different. In the military, consequences were swift. A mistake could cost lives, and accountability was ingrained into the very structure of command. But out here, on the streets, men like Knox had worn their badges like shields, believing themselves untouchable, until now. Across town, Knox sat in a windowless conference room, his fists clenched under the table. The man sitting across from him, Chief Eldon Baker, was old school. Gray hair, steely gaze. The kind of man who didn't tolerate mistakes. He had been in law enforcement for 30 years. He had seen officers rise, fall, and vanish without a trace when the system needed to protect itself. And today he was looking at a man about to be swallowed whole. Knox shifted in his seat. "This is bullshit." Baker barely blinked. "I'd watch your tone, Sergeant. You don't have many bargaining chips left." Knox leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "I was doing my job." Baker let out a slow breath, tapping a thick case file on the desk. "You were abusing it." The words hit like a hammer. Knox gritted his teeth, his face flushed with anger. "You don't get it. People like her, they think they're above the law." Baker slammed his hand against the desk, rattling the case file between them. "People like what, Knox?" Silence. Knox swallowed hard. Baker shook his head. Disappointment etched deep in his features. "You don't think I've dealt with officers like you before? You don't think I know exactly who you are?" He exhaled sharply, sitting back. "This department isn't going down with you. We're cooperating with internal affairs. The DA is reviewing your past cases, and if they find what I think they're going to find..." He let the sentence hang. Knox felt it then. The moment where the shield of his badge no longer mattered. The walls were closing in. The press conference was held on the steps of the Memphis City Hall, the marble steps lined with cameras, microphones, and reporters hungry for a quote. Mayor Denise Holloway, a formidable black woman in her early 50s, adjusted the mic before speaking. Her presence commanded the space, not just because of her title, but because of her history. She had fought for reform for years. Now, the spotlight was hers. The events of the past week have been a sobering reminder of the work we still have to do. The wrongful detainment of Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was not an isolated incident, but a reflection of a systemic issue that can no longer be ignored. Effective immediately, the Memphis Police Department will be conducting a full-scale review of traffic stop procedures, with particular focus on racial disparities in enforcement. Monica stood at the edge of the crowd, watching. She hadn't planned on attending. She wasn't here for political theater. But something in her told her to stay, to listen, to see this moment through. Because this wasn't about her anymore. It never had been. The mayor continued, her voice unwavering. "Furthermore, Sergeant Timothy Knox has been officially terminated from the Memphis Police Department." The district attorney's office has opened an inquiry into his past cases, and we are committed to ensuring accountability at every level. The words rippled through the crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously. The story had taken another turn. Knox wasn't just suspended, he was done. Monica exhaled slowly. Not out of relief, but out of knowing. This had never been just about one officer. It was about a system that had let him operate unchecked for years. A system that had only cared when it had no other choice. That night, as the city settled into its usual rhythm, Monica sat in her small apartment, her phone buzzing with messages from people she hadn't heard from in years. Some congratulated her. Some apologized. Some asked what she would do next. She didn't have an answer for that. Her career had been built on fighting battles she could see, on missions where the enemy was clearly defined. But this fight had no clear enemy because racism wasn't a man in a uniform. It wasn't a single corrupt officer. It was a system, a culture, a way of thinking that had lived far longer than she had and would continue unless people forced it to change. She picked up her phone, scrolling through the news updates. One article stood out: The Power of One Voice. How a routine traffic stop became a fight for justice. Monica clicked on it, skimming through the details of her own story. It read like a case study, dissecting every moment. The stop, the arrest, the courtroom battle, Knox's downfall. The final lines caught her attention. Lieutenant Colonel Monica Hayes never intended to become the face of a movement. But sometimes justice isn't about intent. It's about opportunity, about knowing when to speak, when to stand, and when to remind the world that silence is complicity. She sat back, staring at the words. She hadn't set out to make noise, but the noise was here now, and the question remained. What would she do with it? Her phone buzzed again. A new message. Unknown number. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, this is Congressman Aaron Bennett. I'd love to discuss the future with you. I believe your voice could make a real difference. Monica exhaled. The world was watching, and this fight, it was just getting started. What happens when a lieutenant colonel is escorting a fallen soldier back home, but port officials try to stop him? This inspirational story will leave you speechless. A decorated officer, a hero's remains, and an act of blatant injustice. What unfolds next will shake the nation. The port of New Orleans was alive with movement. Ships docking, cranes lifting containers, workers shouting over the constant hum of machinery. Tourists wheeled their suitcases across the pavement, excited for their upcoming cruises. Businessmen checked their watches, impatiently waiting to board. To most, it was just another day at the docks. But for Lieutenant Colonel David Carter, today was anything but ordinary. Dressed in his formal U.S. Army uniform, Carter walked with measured steps toward the security checkpoint, his polished boots striking sharply against the concrete. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable, but the weight in his chest was more than just the bronze stars and ribbons pinned to his jacket. In front of him, resting on a military transport truck, was a flag-draped casket. The remains of Sergeant Matthew Collins, a Marine who had served courageously overseas but would never return home alive. Collins had been just 24 years old, too young to be in a coffin, too young to be mourned by grieving parents who had once dreamed of welcoming him back with open arms, not folded flags. His family was waiting for him back in Georgia, still unaware of the unnecessary struggle Carter was about to face. As he approached the security counter, a middle-aged white woman in a crisp uniform barely glanced at him. She tapped at her keyboard with disinterest before finally looking up. Her eyes flickered to the casket, then back to Carter. Something shifted in her expression. There was a hesitation, a flicker of something unreadable. He had seen this before, too many times to count, but never in this context. Never when he was carrying out one of the most sacred duties of his career. "Sir, can I see your documentation again?" she asked, her voice stiff, professional, but with an edge of something else. Uncertainty, perhaps, or reluctance. Carter remained calm, as he handed over the military transport orders and his army ID. He had done this before, escorting fallen soldiers, ensuring they were treated with the dignity they deserved. The process was routine. The documentation was valid. There should have been no issue. The woman frowned as she scanned through the details, then turned to whisper something to a male colleague, a tall man with a hardened face and an air of quiet authority. The two exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance before the man approached. He studied Carter for a beat longer than necessary before speaking. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant Colonel Carter," the man said, his tone even but firm. "There's been a security update. We can't allow that cargo on this ship." Carter inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had dealt with all sorts of obstacles in his career, diplomatic entanglements, bureaucratic inefficiencies, moments where rules got in the way of doing the right thing. But this was different. "This isn't cargo," he replied, voice measured, unwavering. "It's a Marine, and I have the paperwork to prove it." The man's lips curled into something almost resembling a smirk. "I understand, Colonel, but rules are rules. Without the special clearance from management, that casket isn't going anywhere." Carter's jaw tightened. "Special clearance? This is a standard military transport. I've escorted fallen soldiers before. No such clearance has ever been required." The woman at the counter hesitated, fingers frozen above her keyboard before she spoke again. This time, her voice was quieter, but laced with something sharper. "Look, it's just a procedure. Besides, I didn't know they made that many black officers these days." Silence. The world seemed to pause, the hum of the busy port fading into the background. Carter met her gaze, steady and unwavering. He had heard similar remarks before, sometimes whispered behind his back, sometimes said outright to his face, but never when he was on duty, never when he was carrying out a mission of honor. His grip on the edge of the counter tightened ever so slightly, but his expression remained unreadable, carefully controlled. "Excuse me?" he asked, his tone dangerously neutral. "Nothing personal, sir?" the male supervisor added quickly, raising his hands in mock surrender. "We're just following protocol." Protocol. That word had been used too many times in history to disguise something deeper, something uglier. He had spent his entire career hearing it used as a shield, a convenient excuse to justify unjust decisions. By now, the line behind him had grown. People were watching, listening. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, some shifting uncomfortably. A man in his late 50s, wearing a faded USMC hat, narrowed his eyes at the interaction, his expression darkening as he processed what was happening. Then a voice rang out from somewhere behind Carter, loud enough to cut through the tension, sharp enough to demand attention. "You got an issue with his rank, or the fact that he's black?" Lieutenant Colonel David Carter didn't turn around immediately. He had spent years in the military learning to control his emotions, to measure his words, to never let his temper become a weapon used against him. But the weight of the moment hung in the air like an impending storm. The voice had come from a man standing a few feet behind him, an older gentleman in his 60s with a weathered face and sharp eyes beneath the brim of a faded Vietnam War veteran patch. His name tag on his vest read Robert Bob Henderson, and though Carter didn't know him, the look in Bob's eyes said everything. He had seen this before, had lived through it, and was not going to stay silent. The male supervisor cleared his throat, suddenly aware that the quiet murmurs around them had grown louder. "Sir, this has nothing to do with race," he said, shifting on his feet. "It's just a standard security check. These are high-level transport orders, and we have to be thorough." Bob scoffed, shaking his head. "Bull. I've been through ports like this my whole damn life, and I've never seen security stop a soldier from bringing a fallen comrade home." He crossed his arms, his posture solid, immovable. The woman behind the counter swallowed hard, her fingers still hovering above her keyboard, uncertain. She wasn't prepared for this kind of attention, for people actually pushing back. Carter exhaled, keeping his voice measured, controlled. Sergeant Collins served his country. His family is waiting for him. and I have followed every protocol, submitted every document. So unless there's a written policy that suddenly changed this morning, I expect you to let me board that ship with him." The supervisor hesitated, his gaze darting toward his colleague. He wasn't prepared for resistance. He had likely expected Carter to back down, to comply, to accept the injustice quietly. But Carter wasn't moving, and neither was Bob. Then, another voice chimed in. "Excuse me." A young woman, no older than 25, stepped forward, her phone raised. "I don't mean to intrude, but I just want to make sure I understand. Are you denying a military officer the ability to escort a fallen soldier because of security? Or is there something else going on here?" More murmurs spread through the growing crowd. A young man in a hoodie pulled out his phone, fingers moving rapidly across the screen. Within seconds, there were more phones raised, cameras capturing everything. A middle-aged woman in a denim jacket leaned toward her husband, shaking her head. "This is disgusting," she muttered. "He's just trying to do his job." The supervisor straightened his posture, glancing at the cameras. He wasn't just dealing with a few upset passengers anymore. This was becoming a scene, a potential public relations disaster. The tension in his expression was clear. "Ma'am," he said, turning toward the woman with the phone, "this is a private matter. We ask that you respect the process." The woman didn't lower her phone. "This doesn't look like a private matter to me," she countered. "This looks like discrimination." Bob let out a low chuckle. She's got a point. The murmurs turned into full conversations. People weren't just watching anymore. They were engaging, questioning, speaking up. And the more attention the situation gained, the more uncomfortable the staff behind the counter became. The woman who had first denied Carter looked visibly shaken now, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the computer screen in front of her, as if desperately looking for something. An excuse, an out, anything to make this go away. Then Bob took a step closer to Carter and lowered his voice. "I know people in the airline industry. I can make a call." Carter hesitated for only a second before nodding. If there was another way to get Sergeant Collins home, he would take it. He wasn't going to waste more time arguing with people who refused to see reason. Bob stepped back, pulled out his phone, and walked a few feet away, already dialing. Carter remained where he was, staring directly at the supervisor, unblinking. "You had an opportunity to do the right thing," he said evenly, "and you chose not to." The supervisor exhaled sharply, clearly regretting how far this had gone. He reached for his radio, muttering something under his breath. The woman at the counter swallowed hard and looked down. She had stopped typing. She wasn't even pretending to be busy anymore. Then Bob returned. "Got it handled," he said. "A friend of mine works for a private airline. They're sending a plane." Carter let out a slow breath. Relief. But not victory. Not yet. The tension in the air shifted. The staff behind the counter knew they had lost. The young woman, still live streaming, turned her phone slightly toward Carter. "Colonel, would you like to say anything?" He met her gaze and shook his head. "This isn't about me. This is about getting a soldier home." By now, the hashtags were already trending on social media. "Let him go home" and "Our racial disgrace" flooded Twitter and TikTok. News outlets began picking up the story. Veterans organizations released statements condemning what had happened, and even a senator weighed in, calling for an investigation into racial discrimination at the port. Within an hour, the original staff at the checkpoint had been removed from duty, replaced by a higher-ranking port officer who approached Carter personally and apologized for the misunderstanding. Carter didn't say much in response. The apology wasn't meant for him. It was meant for damage control. When the private plane arrived, Carter and Bob carefully escorted Sergeant Collins's casket onto the aircraft. The crew, composed mostly of former military personnel, stood at attention as the flag-draped coffin was placed securely inside. Before stepping onto the plane, Carter turned to Bob. "You didn't have to do this." "But you did." Bob simply smiled, shaking his hand. "Back in '75, when I came home, nobody gave a damn about us. We were just another problem to ignore. I swore I'd never let that happen to another soldier. Carter saluted him. Bob saluted back. As the plane's engines roared to life, carrying Sergeant Collins home, Carter finally let out a deep breath. Mission complete. But the fight for respect, for equality, was far from over. As he looked out the window, watching the coastline disappear below, Carter knew one thing for certain. Some battles aren't fought on the battlefield. Some battles are fought right here, at home. As the private aircraft carrying Sergeant Matthew Collins soared into the sky, Lieutenant Colonel David Carter exhaled slowly. He had faced many challenges in his military career, but today's battle had not been fought on the front lines of a distant war. It had been waged at home on American soil, in a place where a soldier's dignity should never have been questioned. His grip on the seat tightened as he thought about what had just happened. The blatant disrespect, the unnecessary obstacles, the veiled racism, all under the guise of security protocol. It wasn't the first time he had experienced this kind of treatment, and it likely wouldn't be the last, but today was different. Today, people had seen it unfold in real time. He glanced at Bob Henderson, the Vietnam veteran who had stepped in when it mattered most. Bob was seated a few rows away, his gaze focused out the window, his fingers tapping idly against the armrest. He had been through his own struggles, and it was clear he saw something familiar in today's events. After a while, Bob turned to him and let out a small chuckle. "Hell of a day, huh?" Carter nodded, though he wasn't in the mood to laugh. "Yeah, and it's not over yet." He pulled out his phone. The notifications were endless. Messages from fellow officers, texts from friends and family, a flood of emails from reporters seeking a statement. Social media had turned the incident into a national story. Hashtags like, "Nar, let him go home," "Now respect our soldiers," and "No more discrimination" were trending. The videos taken by passengers at the port had amassed millions of views. People were outraged, and rightfully so. The military community was rallying behind Carter and Sergeant Collins, and even civilians with no ties to the armed forces were calling for action. Bob leaned over slightly. "You're going to be hearing about this for a while. You ready for that?" Carter sighed, rubbing his temple. "I didn't ask for attention. I just wanted to do my job." Bob nodded. "Yeah, well, sometimes the fight comes to you whether you want it or not." He paused before adding, "You handled yourself well back there. Kept your cool. That's not easy." Carter met his gaze. "Would it have made a difference if I hadn't?" Bob exhaled through his nose. "Probably not." He shook his head. "But if you'd lost your temper, they would have had an excuse. That's what they wanted. A reason to dismiss you as just another angry black man making a scene." Carter let that sink in. He knew Bob was right. It was the same unspoken rule he had learned from his father, a military man himself. You have to be better, smarter, more composed, because the moment you step out of line, they'll say you were never worthy of the uniform in the first place. The flight continued in silence for a while. Carter leaned back and closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind was racing. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every soldier who had ever been disrespected, every black officer who had to work twice as hard to prove himself, every grieving family who shouldn't have to fight for the basic dignity of their fallen loved ones. He thought about Sergeant Collins' family, waiting back home, oblivious to the fight it had taken just to get him on this flight. Would they ever know what had happened? Should they? His phone vibrated again. This time, it was a message from a retired general, someone Carter deeply respected. The text was simple but carried weight. "We stand with you. Call me when you land." Carter wasn't sure what that meant yet, but he had a feeling this was just the beginning. By the time the plane landed in Atlanta, Georgia, the media storm had only grown stronger. Carter could already see reporters stationed near the terminal exit, cameras ready, microphones poised. He had no interest in making a statement, but as soon as he stepped off the plane with Bob by his side, the questions started flying. "Lieutenant Colonel Carter, how do you feel about what happened at the port? Do you believe racism played a role in the denial of your boarding?" Are you planning to file a formal complaint against the port authorities? He ignored them all, moving with purpose toward the waiting military honor guard, who stood solemnly by the hearse meant to carry Sergeant Collins home. The moment wasn't about press, about controversy. It was about duty. Bob, however, wasn't as restrained. As they walked, a young reporter with a microphone got too close, and Bob turned sharply. How do you think he feels? He snapped. A damn war hero had to fight just to do the right thing. That's not a question you should be asking him. That's a question you should be asking this country. The reporter stepped back, startled. But Bob wasn't done. Right about that, he muttered before following Carter. The transfer of Sergeant Collins's remains was handled with precision and honor. As the casket was placed into the hearse, Carter took a moment, resting his hand on the flag covering it. You're home now, he whispered. But the story didn't end there. Over the next several days, the backlash against the New Orleans port authorities intensified. Veterans groups, civil rights organizations, and politicians across the country condemned what had happened. There were calls for investigations, demands for accountability. The governor of Louisiana even released a statement, saying he was deeply troubled by the incident and promising a full review. The port officials who had denied Carter were quickly placed on administrative leave, though many believed it was only a public relations move to quell the outrage. But for Carter, that wasn't enough. A symbolic punishment wouldn't fix the real issue. One evening, he received an invitation to speak at a national military conference about his experience. He had no interest in publicity, but after much thought, he accepted. If his story could be used to create real change, then maybe the frustration, the anger, the humiliation, it would all be worth it. When he finally took the stage in front of a packed room of officers, politicians, and veterans, he kept his message clear. I don't need apologies, he began. I don't need press releases or carefully worded statements from people who were never in danger of being disrespected the way I was. What I need, what we all need, is for this to never happen again. Not to me, not to another officer, not to another grieving family trying to bring their loved one home. The room was silent. Carter scanned the faces before him. Some nodded. Some looked uncomfortable, but every single person was listening. This isn't just about me, he continued. This is about respect. It's about dignity. It's about the promise we make to every soldier who puts on this uniform, that we will never leave them behind. That includes how we treat them in life and how we honor them in death. He let that sit for a moment before delivering his final words. No one should have to fight for something that should already be guaranteed. Applause erupted, but Carter didn't stay to bask in it. As soon as he stepped off the stage, he made his way toward the exit. Bob was waiting for him, arms crossed, a proud smirk on his face. Not bad, Colonel, Bob said. Carter shook his head, exhaling. It's not enough. Bob nodded knowingly. It never is. But it's a damn good start. They walked out together into the night, the echoes of applause still trailing behind them. Carter didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. This fight wasn't over, and he was ready for whatever came next. Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended while trespassing in a downtown parking garage, the prosecutor declared, her tone void of warmth. He refused to vacate the premises despite repeated requests from security. The man seated at the defense table didn't lift his head. His voice barely broke the silence. I just needed somewhere warm. Just to make it through the night. A few soft chuckles rippled through the gallery, but not from the judge, not after he heard the man's name. Who was this man? And why did the judge suddenly go rigid, his eyes fixed on the defendant like he was staring at a ghost? And before we dive deeper into this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Is it anywhere near where he was arrested? Clarence Boone, 68, had become a ghost in the streets of St. Louis, Missouri. He had no fixed address, No belongings aside from the canvas tote he carried on his shoulder, stitched with old police patches that had long faded in the sun. Most people downtown knew him as the quiet one, a man who never begged, never ranted, and never caused a scene. He simply appeared and disappeared, like shadows in alleys, collecting bottles or reading discarded newspapers on park benches. Few knew he had once worn a badge. Clarence had served with the St. Louis Police Department for nearly 3 decades. He'd joined the force in 1981, one of the first black officers assigned to the North Patrol Division. In his time, he had worked narcotics, homicide, and eventually made detective. He was known for being fair, calm under pressure, and fiercely protective of his community, especially the black neighborhoods the city often ignored. But when his wife, Lena, died in 2010 after complications from surgery the city's health system delayed approving, Clarence unraveled. His grief was quiet, but devastating. He withdrew from colleagues, retired early, and stopped showing up to department events. A paperwork glitch during a pension system overhaul resulted in his benefits being cut off. Clarence never fought it. He simply disappeared. On a bitter January morning, with wind cutting through the streets like knives, Clarence had found shelter on level B2 of the parking garage at 10th and Pine. It wasn't the first time. The security guard had seen him before, always polite, always leaving when asked. But this time, Clarence didn't move. He was too cold, too tired. He just needed to rest. "You can't sleep here, sir," the guard said again, his voice more forceful now. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Clarence replied from beneath an old army surplus blanket. "Just trying to make it till morning?" But the property owner had grown impatient with the complaints. Police were called. 2 officers arrived within minutes. The younger of the 2, Officer Deacon, hesitated when he saw Clarence's dog tags and the faded police patch on his tote. "Sir," he asked softly, "you used to be on the job?" Clarence gave a small nod. "Long time ago." Officer Deacon sighed, but protocol was clear. "I'm sorry. They're pressing charges." At the precinct, Clarence was processed like any other misdemeanor offender. Fingerprints, mugshot, brief questioning. A public defender was assigned to his case, an overworked man juggling 24 files and counting. "Just plead out," he advised, without much eye contact. "It's a low-level charge, maybe a week in holding." Clarence said nothing, just nodded. The next morning, he appeared before a judge in Division 13 of the St. Louis Municipal Court. His hair was unkempt, his coat still damp from the night before. No family waited in the gallery. No friends. Just clerks, a few reporters scribbling notes for unrelated cases, and the tired churn of bureaucracy. Case number 23-0581, the State of Missouri versus Clarence Boone, the clerk called out. The prosecutor, barely into his 30s, rose to speak. "Your Honor, the defendant was found sleeping in a restricted area. He has prior citations for loitering and trespassing. Given his repeated offenses and lack of a stable address, we request continued detention until trial." Judge Ernest Malden barely glanced up. Known for his sharp tongue and stricter rulings, he rarely showed leniency for repeat offenders. He flipped open the file, pen in hand. "Mr. Boone, how do you plead?" Clarence stood, slowly. His voice was gravel. "Guilty, Your Honor. I just needed somewhere to stay out of the cold." A murmur of laughter rolled from the back of the room. Judge Malden shot a look toward the gallery, and the room quieted. Then, as he returned to the folder in front of him, his pen paused. He adjusted his glasses. "Clarence James Boone," he read aloud. Something flickered in his eyes. He read again, then looked up, looked hard. The courtroom stilled. Without saying another word, Judge Malden stood, The gesture, small but seismic, sent confusion through the room. Judges don't stand during routine hearings. Court officers glanced at one another. The judge's knuckles turned white as he gripped the bench. "This court is in recess for 15 minutes, he announced suddenly. "The defendant will remain." Clarence didn't move. His face showed no surprise, no relief. For men like him, interruptions, delays, were the story of their life. In his chambers, Judge Malden opened a bottom drawer of an old filing cabinet. Inside was a shoebox filled with mementos from his academy days, rookie photos, badges, yellowed notes from instructors. He pulled out a folded photo, a graduation shot from the 1980s. There he was, young, nervous, white uniform cap askew. Standing behind him was a black officer with a commanding smile and a firm hand on his shoulder. Clarence Boone. "Boone," he whispered, "you trained me." Malden sat down hard, the air thick in his lungs. For years he had remembered the name, the calm voice that had guided him through his first domestic call, through his first homicide scene. Boone had been more than a mentor. He had been a compass, and now he was in a courtroom on trial for trying to survive the cold. Malden reached for the phone. "Get me Deputy Chief Janet Raymond," he said, "and someone from the pension board. Now." When court reconvened that morning, Clarence Boone entered the room with a different look in his eyes. Someone had given him clean clothes, an ironed white shirt, tan khakis, and a pair of modest but intact sneakers. His hair was combed, his beard trimmed. He didn't smile. He rarely did. But he walked straighter, more aware. At the front of the courtroom, seated behind the prosecution table, stood a woman in a sharply pressed navy blue uniform. Her face was familiar. It took him a second to place it, time rewriting features he hadn't seen in decades. Janet Raymond. Once a rookie cop. Now Deputy Chief of the St. Louis Police Department. Clarence stared at her quietly. She gave him a small nod, her eyes softening. He clutched the strap of the worn canvas tote hanging from his shoulder. Inside, wrapped in a sandwich bag, was a photograph of his wife, Lena. He carried it with him through every season, every street corner, every night spent under bridges and stairwells. The courtroom was full, unexpectedly so. Yesterday there had been empty benches and disinterested gazes. Today, the gallery was packed. Retired officers in civilian clothes with worn hands and straight backs, young recruits, law students, journalists, and others, neighbors, city workers, a few people from shelters who had known the man only as Mr. Boone from park benches and sidewalks. They had come because something about the sudden shift in this minor case had captured the city's attention. "Before we proceed with the formal charges," Judge Malden began, his tone slower and more deliberate than usual, "this court will hear testimony concerning the background of the defendant, which may bear relevance to the court's decision." The silence in the room was thick. Even the rustle of papers stopped. Deputy Chief Janet Raymond rose from her seat and took the witness stand. Her voice, honed by years of command, rang with practiced clarity. "My name is Janet Raymond. I currently serve as Deputy Chief of Police for the city of St. Louis. I first met Clarence Boone in 1998 when I was a rookie officer under his training supervision." She paused and looked toward Clarence. "He was the first to teach me that community policing meant more than walking a beat. It meant listening. It meant showing up for people even when the badge wasn't visible. I watched him negotiate with a suicidal teenager on a rooftop for over 2 hours without drawing his weapon. I saw him buy dinner for a homeless veteran instead of running him off. He taught me to treat every person, no matter their story, with dignity." Raymond handed a folder to the court clerk, then turned back to the judge. "Upon reviewing his service records and personnel files, we discovered a critical administrative error. In 2010, following a citywide pension system overhaul, Mr. Boone's retirement benefits were suspended due to a mismatched address on file. Because mail was returned undelivered, the system marked his account inactive, and he was never paid again. A hush fell over the courtroom. He has been owed more than $300,000 in back pension, medical benefits, and adjustments. He never complained, never filed a claim. He simply vanished from the system. Judge Malden leaned forward slightly. His face was tight. Raymond wasn't done. In addition, she continued, her voice tightening with emotion, we've collected statements from former officers who served alongside Mr. Boone. Captain Eric Navarro, Lieutenant Linwood Chase, and several others. They described acts of bravery and compassion, including the 1992 Southside chemical plant hostage situation, where Mr. Boone alone negotiated the release of a woman and child without loss of life. He didn't ask for recognition. He just did the job. She turned once more toward Clarence. He didn't just serve this city. He shaped it. Clarence stood motionless, eyes fixed on a crack in the courtroom floor. His hands trembled faintly. Mr. Boone, Judge Malden said, please step forward. Clarence walked to the bench, slow but steady. The judge removed his glasses and set them on the desk. You may not remember me, he said. But in 1987, you were assigned to train a green cadet who was more afraid of the paperwork than the streets. He gave a small, tired smile. That cadet was me. Clarence blinked, then chuckled, a quiet, dry sound. You were the one who spilled coffee on the dash on your first patrol, he said, his voice rough from disuse. Malden laughed softly. I was. The room relaxed, just slightly. I became a judge because I wanted to continue serving. But you, Mr. Boone, you laid the foundation for that. You didn't just teach me how to wear the uniform, you taught me how to live with it. He turned to the young prosecutor who stood uncertainly. In light of this testimony, Malden said, does the state wish to proceed with charges? The prosecutor swallowed. Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Boone with prejudice. So ordered, the judge replied. Mr. Boone, you are free to go. On behalf of this court and this city, I offer our deepest apologies. Clarence didn't move at first. It took a few seconds for the words to settle. When the bailiff stepped forward to release him, Clarence looked down at his wrists, at the cuffs that had dug into skin too thin to fight. Then he looked up. From the gallery, a woman rose, mid-40s, curly hair, tears already streaming. Uncle Clarence, she called. He turned. It's me, Tasha, Lena's niece. We've been looking for you for years. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him before he could speak. It was the first time someone had touched him gently in over a decade. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, but Clarence ignored them. Raymond approached with a soft smile. We're working with the pension board. You'll get every cent back, but there's more. She paused. We'd like to ask you to come back to the department, not as an officer, but as a mentor. These kids coming out of the academy, they need someone like you. Clarence took a breath, the kind he hadn't drawn in years. I don't know how much I have left to give, he said. Raymond smiled wider. Even 5 minutes of your story could change someone's life. That afternoon, the story broke nationwide. Homeless ex-cop found living on streets after pension error, the headlines read. Video clips of the courtroom spread across social media, racking up millions of views. In the comment sections, people shared stories of forgotten veterans, lost public servants, and the silent dignity of those who fall between the cracks. By sunset, a local charity had set up a temporary apartment for Clarence in Midtown. It wasn't large or luxurious, but it had heat, running water, and a bed with clean sheets. He walked through it slowly, touching the walls, as if afraid it would vanish. He placed Lena's photo on the nightstand. For the first time in 15 years, he slept in a bed, not on concrete. And that night, in a room with a locked door and a working heater, Clarence Boone dreamed not of loss, but of beginnings. Over the next several days, Clarence Boone's name rippled across St. Louis like the toll of a church bell, steady, resonant, impossible to ignore. His story traveled fast. Local news anchors opened their nightly segments with updates on the once-forgotten man now hailed as a symbol of honor, lost and reclaimed. Radio call-in shows lit up with veterans sharing their own stories of missed benefits and broken systems. In neighborhoods where he once walked his beat, residents put candles in windows and signs that read, "We remember Officer Boone." Photos of him in uniform, young and proud, were now being passed around social media alongside heartbreaking images of him huddled under an overpass in the bitter Missouri winter. The contrast broke hearts, stirred anger, and sparked urgent questions in City Hall about how many more were like him, how many more were lost in silence. Clarence, however, remained remarkably quiet in the days that followed. He had never sought attention, and now that it came, he accepted it with a kind of reluctant grace. When city officials offered to host a public recognition ceremony, he initially refused. "I'm not looking for a parade," he told Tasha one evening as they sat in his temporary apartment. "I just wanted a place to sleep without having to explain myself." But Tasha, persistent and protective, squeezed his hand to her. "Uncle Clarence, this isn't just about you anymore. You showing up, letting people see you, it matters. Not everyone gets a second chance to speak for those who can't." He nodded, slowly, and he agreed. 1 week later, under the high ceilings of the historic Sheldon Concert Hall, Clarence stood on a stage, dressed in a navy blue suit tailored just for him by a local veteran outreach program. His detective badge had been polished, and his military decorations had been carefully arranged on the lapel. A hush fell over the room as he approached the microphone. The audience included officers past and present, city leaders, faith leaders, veterans, and dozens of new recruits and from the police academy. Mayor Lorraine Fields offered an emotional tribute, and when Judge Ernest Malden took the podium to speak, the entire audience rose in applause before he even said a word. "I am standing here today because a man chose to carry me when I couldn't carry myself," Malden said, his voice thick. "That man is Clarence Boone." Clarence didn't speak long when his turn came. His voice was steady but unpolished, the voice of someone who hadn't addressed a crowd in years. "I don't want your pity," he began, looking directly into the eyes of the young cadet seated in the front row. "I want your attention. I want you to remember that the badge you wear doesn't make you better than anyone. And if you ever forget that, you'll start to forget the people you're meant to serve." He paused, then added, "I used to wear that badge. Then I walked the streets without it. I've been treated like a hero, and I've been treated like I didn't exist. The truth is, I was the same man both times." That speech was replayed on every local channel and quoted in national media. Overnight, Clarence Boone became more than a news story. He became a mirror reflecting a truth too long ignored. In response, the city council moved swiftly. Within 2 weeks, they passed a resolution establishing the Boone Initiative, a joint project between the police department, the Department of Human Services, and veteran organizations to locate and assist former first responders and veterans whose benefits had been cut or lost. The program offered emergency housing, legal aid, and case management to ensure that what happened to Clarence wouldn't happen again. In just 6 months, it had restored benefits to over 35 individuals. Clarence attended nearly every intake session, shaking hands, listening quietly, and simply being present. He declined most interview requests, but agreed to appear at community forums and recruit graduations. He spoke not about heroism, but about dignity, about what it meant to be invisible in a city he once served. "You don't get to judge someone's worth by the clothes on their back," he told one graduating class. "Sometimes the person sleeping on the sidewalk taught someone how to save a life." Clarence moved into a newly constructed veterans housing complex near Lafayette Park. It wasn't big, but it was warm, safe, and his. Over time, he began decorating the walls. Photos of Lena from their younger years, a framed copy of his academy graduation, a photo of him at a community event standing next to Mayor Fields and Deputy Chief Raymond. But the centerpiece of the living room was simpler. A black and white photo of a young boy smiling shyly next to a patrol car. A thank you letter scribbled beneath in crayon. Officer Boone helped me find my dog. He didn't yell. He just listened. On the first chilly morning of October, Clarence returned to the courthouse bench where, months earlier, he had waited for a judge to sentence him for trespassing. He sat quietly, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup, watching people pass. A young mother approached, her son in tow. The boy looked up and tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, that's the man from the video, right?" She smiled and nodded to Clarence. "Thank you for everything, sir," she said. He simply tipped his cap. Letters kept arriving. One from a former cadet who had left the force after developing PTSD, who said he had felt ashamed until he saw Clarence's story. Another from a woman whose father had been a firefighter who died alone. "Your story gave me hope," she wrote. "You were lost, but you were found." That winter, Clarence was honored with the director's Distinguished Public Service Award from the Department of Justice, an award rarely given to civilians. The official citation called him a model of service, humility, and resilience. The award arrived with a personal note. "Your silence has spoken more than our laws. Thank you for reminding us who we serve." On Veterans Day, Clarence stood before a crowd at Fort Leonard Wood, his military uniform once again pressed and proper. For the first time in over 15 years, he felt completely like himself again, not someone hiding from the past, but someone carrying it forward. He looked out over rows of new recruits, retirees in folding chairs, families wrapped in blankets under a cool Missouri breeze. "I've walked both sides," he told them. "I've served this country and been left behind by it. I don't regret either, because what I've learned is this. Justice is patient, but it's real. It may come late, but when it comes, it restores more than one life." As he stepped down from the podium, the audience rose in silence. Officers, cadets, civilians, they all stood and saluted. Clarence returned the gesture, slowly and with pride, his spine straight, his gaze forward, his steps certain. That evening, back in his apartment, Clarence sat in his armchair facing the window, Lena's photo beside him, a quilt over his legs. Outside, the world moved on. Cars drove by. Porch lights flicked on. Children laughed on the sidewalks. He took it all in with quiet contentment. For the first time in decades, Clarence Boone was not wondering where he would sleep, not wondering if anyone remembered. He was remembered. He was seen. And more importantly, he had helped others be seen. Justice, he now believed, doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be quick. It just needs to be witnessed. And for those patient enough to wait and strong enough to endure, it will come. Sometimes, late, but always, just in time.